Jim Morrison died twice. The first death was that of the Lizard King, the leather sex god, the symbol of rebellion. He was killed by his creator, a weary poet named Jim, who fled to Paris to escape his own fame monster. The second death was that of the poet, behind a locked door, a quiet, mysterious, unexplained death. History tells only of the second death, but ignores the spiritual suicide that led to it. This is the story of both deaths and the question of whether a man can truly survive having killed his own legend. To understand the fire that burned inside Jim Morrison, born December 8, 1943, you must first understand the world that tried to contain it. The America of the 1950s, the backdrop of his childhood, was a nation holding its breath. It was a land of manicured lawns and rigid social codes built on post-war prosperity and Cold War paranoia. In this era of conformity, where sanitized television families represented the national ideal, you were expected to get in line, keep your head down, and not ask too many questions. For a boy like Jim, this world wasn't a comfort. It was a cage. His childhood was a life of constant upheaval, a perpetual movement from base to base as the son of a career naval officer, the future Rear Admiral George Stephen Morrison. This military brat existence fostered a deep sense of detachment, turning Jim into a permanent observer on the fringes of every new social circle. Finding no solace in his transient external world, Morrison retreated inward, making books and his own mind his only true home. Intellectually, the young man was a prodigy, devouring literature with a voracious appetite. He found his true family not in the transient military towns, but in the French symbolist poets like Rimbaud and Baudelaire, who taught him that a poet's duty was to explore the darkest corners of human experience. He absorbed the philosophies of rebellion, especially from Friedrich Nietzsche, whose celebration of the chaotic Dionysian spirit resonated deeply with a soul suffocating in 1950s conformity. The beat writers showed him that a new, raw American language was possible. He was building an intellectual framework for his rebellion against the world he was born into. His father, the very embodiment of the system Jim would spend his life rebelling against, a man of strict discipline and unwavering authority, could not comprehend his introverted, dreaming son. The admiral wanted Jim to attend Annapolis and follow a path of order. Jim wanted to be a poet and embrace chaos. This fundamental conflict culminated when Jim, rejecting his father's ambitions entirely, chose to enroll in the film school at UCLA. This decision marked the final schism, a break so profound that it became a core part of his public identity. This was more than youthful rebellion. It was a symbolic patricide. To fully become the shamanistic poet and performer he envisioned, the Jim Morrison, who was the son of the admiral, had to die. He initiated the final break himself, writing to his parents to inform them of his artistic ambitions and asking them not to contact him further. From that point on, the estrangement was absolute. When the Doors were signed to Elektra Records, Morrison famously told the label that his parents and siblings were dead. This fabrication was printed in the official biography, accompanying the band's debut album, cementing his new identity as an orphan born from poetry and chaos. For his parents, who saw their son's face on magazine covers, it was a source of profound confusion and pain. But for Jim, it was a necessary act of myth-making, a conscious erasure of his past to allow his artistic persona to be born, seemingly without origin, a primal force unto himself. But the defining event of his inner life, the origin myth of his soul, occurred in the deserts of New Mexico. As a small child, his family came upon a horrific accident. A truck full of Native American workers had overturned, scattering bodies across the highway. He saw what he would later describe as Indians bleeding to death. Terrified, the young boy began to cry, but in that moment he felt something profound happen. He believed the souls of the dying Indians leaped from their bodies and entered his own. "I was a filter for them," he would later say, convinced that one or perhaps all of their spirits had flown into his soul. Whether the event happened exactly as he remembered is irrelevant. For Jim, it was a moment of shamanic birth. He became convinced that his own spirit was now intertwined with something ancient, dark, and powerful from the American soil. These desert ghosts would follow him for the rest of his life, becoming the bedrock of his art and his conviction that an artist must be a shaman, one who journeys between worlds to bring back stories for the tribe. With his old self buried and a shamanic identity born from tragedy, Morrison had no choice but to search for an outside world wild enough to match his inner world. He found it in California. Here, in the burgeoning heart of the rebellion, he was no longer just an outsider, he was an enigma. He lived an ascetic bohemian life, eating little, sleeping on rooftops, and filling notebooks with the dark primal poetry that swirled in his shamanic mind. He wasn't just influenced by poets, he was mesmerized by thinkers who broke the rules. He studied the works of Antonin Artaud and his Theater of Cruelty, a theatrical theory that aimed to shock the audience, to shatter their complacency, and force them to confront the raw truths of the subconscious. Artaud argued that theater should be like the plague, a visceral, dangerous experience that purges suppressed emotions. This idea would become central to Morrison's own approach to live performance. He saw film not as entertainment, but as a new kind of magic, a way to capture the raw, unfiltered truth of the subconscious. His student film, a cryptic surrealist piece, was torn apart by his professors and classmates. They saw it as self-indulgent and incomprehensible. For Morrison, this rejection was a profound wound. It was a sign that the academic world, another rigid system, could not contain his vision. He was about to quit, to drift away into obscurity, when a chance encounter on Venice Beach would ignite a sound that defined an era. He bumped into a fellow film student, a quiet, bespectacled keyboardist named Ray Manzarek. Ray knew Jim was a poet, but he'd never heard him sing. Sitting on the sand under the California dusk, Jim, shyly at first, sang the lyrics to a song that had just come to him, Moonlight Drive. Ray was mesmerized. He had never heard lyrics like that. They weren't about cars or girlfriends. They were about mystery, danger, and the underworld of the mind. Ray heard classical and jazz influences in his own keyboard playing, and in Jim's words, he heard the blues, poetry, and something else, something theatrical and shamanistic. In that moment, the Doors were conceived. The true alchemy of the Doors began when Morrison and Manzarek joined forces with two musicians who brought entirely different worlds into the mix. John Dinsmore, a drummer steeped in the dynamics and subtleties of jazz, and Robbie Krieger, a guitarist whose fingers were fluent in the languages of flamenco, folk, and Indian raga as much as electric blues. The resulting sound was a volatile and unprecedented fusion. They were an architectural anomaly in the landscape of rock, most notably for their lack of a traditional bass guitarist. This absence was their secret weapon. Ray Manzarek's left hand, expertly navigating a Fender Rhodes piano bass atop his Vox Continental organ, became the band's hypnotic melodic anchor. This keyboard-centric foundation gave the Doors a sound that was simultaneously cerebral and primal, distinguishing them from every guitar-driven band of the era. Upon this foundation, the other members painted in vivid, contrasting colors. Robbie Krieger was no ordinary rock guitarist. He often played with his fingers instead of a pick, weaving lyrical serpentine melodies, inspired by flamenco and classical music. His bottleneck slide could cry with the pain of the Delta blues or snarl with savage intensity. Critically, he was also a gifted songwriter, penning or co-writing many of the band's most enduring hits, including Light My Fire. John Densmore was the band's sensitive core, a jazz drummer who listened intently, using his articulate sense of dynamics, from a whisper on the hi-hat to a crashing theatrical crescendo, to follow Morrison's volatile improvisations. He provided the framework and tension that kept the chaos from spiraling into incoherence. And at the center of this intricate storm was Morrison, the poet, the shaman, the voice. He was the unpredictable element, the human catalyst who could elevate a performance to a spiritual rite or drag it down into a drunken debacle. Their proving ground, the crucible where this unique identity was forged, was a residency at a dingy Sunset Strip club called the London Fog, and later the legendary Whiskey A Go-Go. In the hedonistic pulse of 1966 Los Angeles, the Whiskey was the epicenter of the new American rock scene, and as the house band, the Doors had the freedom to experiment. Their sets became long, improvisational journeys, a nightly laboratory for musical and psychological exploration. It was here that Morrison underwent a profound transformation. Initially so shy he would often perform with his back to the crowd, he learned, night after night, fueled by alcohol and LSD, to shed his inhibitions. He embraced the role of the shaman, confronting the audience, improvising poetry, and testing the very limits of what a rock performance could be. It was during this residency that their most notorious song, The End, mutated from a simple breakup song into an 11-minute psychodramatic epic. Night after night, the song grew longer, darker, and more theatrical as Morrison began to weave in spoken word poetry, primal screams, and one fateful evening, the infamous Oedipal section, chanting the Greek myth of Oedipus Rex, the desire to kill the father and sleep with the mother. Morrison pushed the boundaries of lyrical content in rock music into uncharted territory. Behind him, the band locked into a menacing hypnotic groove, building the tension to an unbearable peak. The audience was stunned into silence. The club's owner was not. They were fired on the spot. From that moment, their path was set. The Doors had discovered their mission. They were not here to entertain. They were here to confront, to dredge up the dark underbelly of the psyche. This transgressive energy caught the ear of Paul Rothchild, a meticulous producer for the discerning Elektra Records. Rothchild saw what others missed. This wasn't just another rock band, but something dangerous, literary, and profound. He signed them, and together they meticulously crafted their self-titled debut album, released in 1967. It landed on the cultural landscape with seismic force. While San Francisco's Summer of Love was celebrating peace and flower power, the Doors' debut offered a darker, more Freudian alternative. It was the sound of the bad trip, an exploration of fear, sex, and death that opened with the urgent command, break on through to the other side, and closed with the fully realized, terrifying epic, The End. Fame came with a velocity that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Light My Fire shot to number 1 on the charts, and suddenly, Jim Morrison, the brooding poet, was a reluctant pop idol and a bona fide sex symbol. His face, framed by a halo of curls, was on the cover of every teen magazine. This was the first and perhaps most tragic paradox of his life. The very fame that gave him a global platform for his art also began to corrupt and destroy it. He had created the persona of the Lizard King, the leather-clad shaman in complete control, but the character he played on stage began to consume the man off stage, trapping him in a myth of his own making. Jim Morrison fought back against the caricature of fame in the only way he knew how, through provocation, waging a war against the very establishment that lionized him. This war began early and on the biggest possible stage. In 1967, the Doors were booked for The Ed Sullivan Show, the pinnacle of mainstream American entertainment, a broadcast that could solidify a band's career. The producers, wary of censors, explicitly demanded they change a lyric in Light My Fire from Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Higher to Girl, We Couldn't Get Much Better. The band publicly agreed, but when the red light of the live camera blinked on, broadcasting to millions of American families, Morrison sang the original line, his eyes staring defiantly into the lens. It was a calculated act of rebellion. They were banned from the show forever, but for Jim, it was a profound victory. He had refused to be a sanitized, palatable pop idol. However, this rebellious spirit, increasingly doused in staggering amounts of alcohol, began to curdle as the internal conflict deepened. He was haunted by a desperate need to be taken seriously as a poet, but the world only screamed for the Dionysian rock star. In 1969, in a defiant bid to establish his credentials as a serious writer, he used his own money to privately publish 2 of his poetry books, The Lords and The New Creatures. These were not simple song lyrics, but dense, aphoristic collections of his thoughts on cinema, crowds, power and perception, the inner workings of his intellectual world. He sent copies to his literary heroes. The literary world, however, barely noticed. This intellectual rejection stung him more deeply than any music critic's review. It reinforced a growing corrosive cynicism. The world didn't want the artist. It only wanted the myth. Thwarted in his attempt to be recognized for his mind, the distinction between his revolutionary stagecraft and his personal self-destruction completely dissolved. His provocations on stage grew more desperate and erratic. He began to treat the audience not as fans to connect with, but as a single, complacent beast to be confronted. He would show up late, drunk, and deliver rambling, poetic diatribes instead of the hits. He saw it as his duty to break through their passivity, to shock them into a state of genuine feeling. Increasingly, however, he was just breaking himself. This downward spiral reached its point of no return on a hot, humid night in Miami in March of 1969. The concert at the Dinner Key Auditorium was an environment primed for combustion. A greedy promoter had removed the seats and sold thousands more tickets than the venue could hold, creating a tense, sweaty mass of bodies in the suffocating heat. Morrison, who had been drinking all day after a series of missed flights, finally took the stage, bloated and belligerent. Confronted with the physical embodiment of his suffocating fame, he decided to give them a show they would never forget. For over an hour, he taunted, preached to, and insulted the audience, calling them slaves and fucking idiots, pleading with them to break free. He was trying to incite a riot, a moment of true chaotic freedom. What happened next remains a blur of conflicting testimonies and rock and roll legend. Did he actually expose himself on stage? Some witnesses swear he did. Others, including his bandmates, insist he only simulated it. A final act of contempt for his own sex symbol status. In the moral panic of 1969 America, the truth didn't matter. The Lizard King had gone too far. A warrant was issued for his arrest on charges of indecent exposure and profanity. A conservative backlash erupted with rallies for decency held across the country, using Morrison as the poster child for rock's depravity. Concert promoters, fearing protests and legal trouble, canceled their shows. The Doors, once the biggest band in America, became radioactive, blacklisted from venues nationwide. The Miami incident was more than a scandal. It was the public execution of Morrison's artistic spirit. The draining year-long legal battle that followed, culminating in a conviction and a sentence of 6 months in jail, transformed him. The establishment he had fought against had finally managed to label him. In their eyes, he was no longer a poet or a shaman. He was a criminal. The other band members saw a marked change in him. The playful, trickster spirit was gone, replaced by a cynical, embittered man who was physically and emotionally exhausted. He was tired. Tired of the fame, tired of the image, tired of the legal battles, and tired of the suffocating weight of being Jim Morrison. He wanted to disappear, to find a place where the myth could be lifted, and he could simply be a poet again, anonymous and free. He chose Paris, the city of his literary heroes, as his final place of exile. When Jim Morrison arrived in Paris in March of 1971, he was a man in full retreat, a shadow of the lithe, leather-clad rock god he once was. Now overweight, his face bloated from years of heavy drinking, he had traded his iconic image for the anonymity of jeans and a bushy beard, a conscious effort to kill the persona that had consumed him. He had come to the city of his literary heroes, Baudelaire and Rimbaud, as a final act of escape, to flee a looming 6-month prison sentence from the Miami trial, and more desperately, to rediscover the poet who had been lost in the wreckage of his own fame. With him, as always, was Pamela Corson, the one constant, the chaotic talisman at the center of his life. Their love affair was the central vortex of his world, an incandescent bond that was both intensely passionate and brutally destructive. She was his muse, his cosmic mate, the quiet redhead, who he believed was the only person who truly understood the artist behind the myth. But their profound codependency was also a prison, a feedback loop of passion, jealousy, and mutual destruction. In the isolation of their Parisian apartment, this dynamic intensified. He spent his days in a search for meaning, wandering the city's ancient streets, making pilgrimages to the graves of Oscar Wilde and Molière, and filling notebooks with new poetry. This search for artistic resurrection, however, was perpetually drowned in the local bars. All the while, Pam, a beautiful and fragile figure, already deep in her own heroin addiction, pulled him closer to the world of hard drugs he had largely, though not entirely, avoided. Friends who saw him in those final months described a man tragically torn in two. There were moments of clarity and hope where he was optimistic, lucid, and genuinely excited about his writing. The acclaimed French director Agnès Varda, who befriended him, recalled a nice boy, gentle, intelligent, and a far cry from the monstrous public persona. But these moments were fleeting, punctuated by a profound and suffocating depression. He felt creatively adrift, an American exile lost in a city that was indifferent to him. He spoke of his own death with a morbid, almost academic curiosity, telling friends he didn't expect to live much longer, seeing himself as the third in a tragic sequence, fated to follow Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix into the darkness of the 27 Club. His last known creative act, a raw, drunken recording session with 2 American street musicians, is a haunting testament to his state, the sound of a great talent raging, slurring, and laughing against its own exhaustion. Then came the night of July 2nd, 1971. The official story, provided solely by Pamela Corson and hastily signed on a French death certificate, is deceptively, almost suspiciously, simple. After returning from a movie on a warm Parisian evening, Jim began to feel unwell, complaining of chest pains, but refusing a doctor. He decided to take a hot bath to feel better. Sometime in the early morning hours of July 3rd, Pam found him submerged and unresponsive in the tub. A local doctor was called, who summarily pronounced him dead. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, a diagnosis made without a thorough examination. Crucially, because French law at the time did not require an autopsy if there were no obvious signs of foul play, one was never performed. A few days later, Jim Morrison was quietly buried in a simple grave in the Père Lachaise cemetery, his death a muted postscript to a life lived at full volume. But for a man who lived as a public spectacle, this neat private death felt like a final, unbelievable performance. The story, too clean and lacking in detail, began to unravel almost immediately. For decades, a more credible and sordid alternative theory has centered on a Parisian nightclub, the Rock and Roll Circus, a notorious hotspot for rock royalty and a well-known place for scoring high-quality heroin. This version of events, long whispered in rock circles, claims that Morrison did not die peacefully in his apartment bathtub. Instead, seeking to buy heroin for Pamela, he went to the club, a novice with opiates and a man known for his reckless consumption. He allegedly snorted a dose of powerful China white heroin, mistaking its lethal strength, and died almost instantly in a locked toilet stall. This theory, corroborated in a book by the club's former manager, Sam Burnett, was given its most powerful voice in 2014 by the legendary singer Marianne Faithfull. In a bombshell interview, she finally confirmed the long-held rumor, stating that her then-boyfriend, the high society drug dealer Jean de Breteuil, was the one who sold Morrison the fatal dose. According to Faithfull, a panicked de Breteuil and others, terrified of having a dead American rock star on their hands, had Morrison's body secretly carried back to his apartment at 17 Rue Beautreillis. There, they placed him in the bathtub, a desperate and futile attempt to use cold water to revive him from the overdose. This grim narrative explains so much that the official story glosses over. The lack of an immediate call for an ambulance, the frantic secret atmosphere of a drug deal gone wrong, and the bizarre placement of a body in a bath. It recasts Jim's death not as a peaceful, if tragic, passing, but as a sordid, desperate scene in a nightclub bathroom, a far cry from the noble poet's death he might have imagined for himself. Ultimately, the enduring mystery of his death is the final, perfect Morrison poem, full of conflicting narrators, sordid truths, and a central, unanswerable question. The lack of an autopsy is the void around which all theories spin, allowing for endless interpretation. This profound ambiguity was the final, accidental ingredient needed to transform the exhausted, broken man in Paris into an enduring and immortal myth. The death of Jim Morrison was more than just the end of a rock star. It was the definitive end of an era. Coming just 9 months after Hendrix and 10 months after Joplin, his passing at the age of 27 cemented the morbid legend of the 27 Club. It felt like a curse. The three most electrifying and boundary-pushing artists of a generation had been silenced, and with them the utopian dream of the 1960s seemed to die as well. Morrison's legacy is complex. He changed the very definition of a rock and roll frontman. Before him, singers were mostly just singers. He made the frontman a shaman, a provocateur, an antagonist. Every rock star who has ever courted danger, embraced theatrics, and challenged their audience owes a debt to him. Without Jim Morrison, there is no Iggy Pop, no Alice Cooper, no Axl Rose. But his most enduring legacy is perhaps the one he felt most ambivalent about: his image. The photograph of a young, bare-chested Morrison, the young lion, has become one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. It has sold millions of posters and t-shirts, turning a complex, self-destructive poet into a simplified icon of rebellion. He has become a permanent fixture in the cultural imagination, a symbol of doomed youth and artistic integrity. The irony, of course, is that this is the very image he fled to Paris to escape. Furthermore, his legacy as a poet continues to be debated. He self-published 2 volumes of poetry in his lifetime, The Lords and The New Creatures, and they were largely ignored by the literary establishment at the time. After his death, however, his poetry was rediscovered. Was he a great American poet or just a rock star who wrote? The answer lies somewhere in between. He was certainly not an amateur. His poetry is dense, erudite, and has a unique hypnotic rhythm. He was a poet of images, of transcendence, and of disintegration. So what are we left with? A cold grave in a Paris cemetery, a handful of transcendent albums, and a collection of poems that still feel dangerous and alive. We are left with the ghost of a man who desperately wanted to break on through to the other side. Perhaps in his mind, he was searching for the spirits of those dead Indians on the highway, trying to understand the vision that had set him on his path. His story is a profound lesson on the corrosive nature of fame and the terrible price of being a myth. He created the persona of the Lizard King, this larger-than-life shaman, but in the end, the persona became the man, and the man underneath was lost. He sought to conjure and control the chaos he worshipped, but in the end, that same chaos consumed him. The ultimate tragedy of Jim Morrison is not that he died at 27. It's that the poet, the quiet, intelligent boy from Florida, who loved books and myth, died long before that, suffocated by the rock god the world demanded he be. His final silent exit in Paris was not the last act of a god, but the final desperate whisper of a poet who had simply run out of words.